Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the case. Right, let's get comfy and relax, and let's begin. Story 1. Yang Tianyong, born in 1959 in Chuxiang, Yunnan, China. From childhood, he was known as a problematic kid, lazy in his studies but fond of mischief and destruction. However, nature had blessed him with a strong, robust physique. Seeing their son's lack of interest in studying, his family decided that when he grew up, it would be best to send him into the military. This was perhaps a logical decision at the time, because in that era, joining the military wasn't just an honor, but also a guarantee for the future. After discharge, soldiers would be assigned stable government jobs. So when he came of age, Tianyong enlisted. After his military service, Tianyong was assigned to work at the Kunming Railway Bureau, becoming a police officer at the East Station Police Department. For a young man from a poor rural background, becoming a city police officer was indeed an enviable turning point. But Tianyong wasn't one to stay content. Instead of diligently fulfilling his duties as a police officer, he lived recklessly and without discipline, even missing work without reason. Most importantly, throughout his years of service, he became notorious for his inability to get along with colleagues, always looking to cause trouble and ready to fight over the smallest issues. Gradually, no one wanted to work with him. Colleagues avoided him like a bomb that could explode at any moment. The situation became so tense that during a personnel transfer, the leadership tried to reassign him to prison duty, a move they thought clever to rid themselves of this time bomb. But for Tianyong, being transferred from a railway police officer to working in a prison environment was unacceptable. In his eyes, this was nothing short of punishment, from being a person of authority to someone who had to face inmates all day. Feeling humiliated and coerced in his anger, he had a fierce confrontation with the unit leadership. This confrontation led to a tragic outcome. He was fired without mercy. In just one day, he went from being a police officer to unemployed. Bitterness grew increasingly in Tianyong's heart. After more than a decade serving in law enforcement, he was left with nothing but bitterness. No fame, no fortune, no status. Worse still, with limited education and no specialized skills, finding new employment seemed impossible. In the years that followed, he lived an aimless life, wandering the streets filled with hatred for society. Perhaps it was during these dark days that the seeds of crime began to germinate in Tianyong's twisted mind. By 1996, he encountered his old friend Xiao Lin. Lin was born in 1960, 2 years younger than Tianyong. His hometown was in Jiamusi City, Heilongjiang Province. When he was young, he followed his parents to Yunnan, attending elementary and middle school there. Later, he returned to his hometown with his parents. Like Tianyong, Lin had also served in the military. But unlike his friend who had been a police officer, he had early on fallen into a life of crime, living dishonestly through various petty thefts. Before meeting Tianyong again, Lin had just pulled off a bold fraud scheme in northeast China in 1995, stealing 1 million yuan, about $120,000. Lucky for him, due to lack of decisive evidence, he escaped being placed on the wanted list. However, Lin understood that with such a large sum of money, sooner or later the police would find leads. Therefore, he decided to return to Yunnan, where he had spent his childhood, to hide and avoid attention. In Kunming, the meeting between Tianyong and Lin seemed like a cruel joke of fate. Before Tianyong's eyes, his old friend Lin now lived a life of luxury, spending money lavishly. This sight only intensified the bitterness in Tianyong's heart, and his envious gaze couldn't hide his jealousy of his old friend's lifestyle. Because he understood Tianyong's character so well, when he heard his old friend had been forced to leave the police force, Lin wasn't surprised at all. Like a carefully calculated move, Lin began sharing details of his fraud scheme, dropping pieces of information like bait to test the former police officer's reaction. It was a risky gamble. Lin knew while he was taking a chance. After all, Tianyong had been a police officer for many years, and one word of denunciation from him could make everything collapse. But as Lin thought, Tianyong not only didn't object, but showed particular interest. Through Tianyong's hungry gaze, Lin realized that he desperately needed money, and more importantly, was willing to do anything to get it. After that, during each meeting, Tianyong and Lin would eagerly discuss plans for quick wealth. They heard rumors about people who had built fortunes through smuggling and other illegal activities. But both understood this wasn't simple. In other words, they needed resources and guidance. This was the weakness of both men. Though Tianyong was a former police officer, he had never had connections to the criminal underworld, and Lin had just arrived in Kunming, where everything was still unfamiliar. With just two people, executing major operations seemed impossible. In early 1997, Tianyong and Lin decided to form a gang. They understood that the success of their plan depended on choosing absolutely loyal and trustworthy members. The first person Lin thought of was his own younger brother, Shaoli. Though only 25 and holding a stable job at a pesticide factory in his hometown, Li always absolutely trusted and obeyed his older brother. As soon as Lin had established himself in Kunming, he convinced his younger brother to quit his job and join them. Besides his brother, Lin specially called his longtime friend Chai Guoli from Jiamusi Heilongjiang. There was also someone named Tung Diendong, a fellow countryman Lin had met when he first returned to Kunming and was hospitalized. At that time, Diendong couldn't even afford his hospital bills, but it was clear he valued loyalty and knew how to repay kindness. So Lin helped Diendong pay his hospital bills. And indeed, Lin had an excellent eye for character. After leaving the hospital, the two became sworn brothers, and Diendong naturally became a link in Tianyong and Lin's gang. He also called another trusted countryman, Zhu Shuguang. Tianyong brought in his cousin Yang Mingchai from his hometown in Chuxiang. Thus, the 7-member gang was officially formed. Except for Tianyong and Mingchai, who were from Yunnan, the other 5 were all from northeast China. With the team assembled, what would they do? After discussion, they decided to target car theft. The automotive market was quite active then, with good cars being particularly scarce and hard to buy. They figured stealing cars and reselling them would surely be profitable. With his experience as a former police officer, Tianyong had deeper calculations than his accomplices. He understood that in the criminal world, no witnesses could be left behind. To avoid detection, they had to act ruthlessly and decisively, which meant being ready to kill to silence witnesses. April 6, 1997 marked a fateful day that began their bloody crime spree. Their first target was chosen within Kunming City. That afternoon, Lin took Diendong and Guoli to the Chunyuan residential area. Before leaving, Tianyong had equipped Lin with 2 grenades and a dagger, the grenades he had stolen when leaving the military, never imagining they would be used years later. After a while, they spotted an expensive-looking jeep. In the back seat, a man was busy arranging items, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Lin and Guoli quickly approached, opened the car door, and got into the back seat. Before the victim could react, Lin immediately struck him with the grenade, rendering him unconscious. Then, Guoli and Diendong coordinated their attack, repeatedly stabbing the car owner with the dagger. Thinking the victim was dead, Lin's group decided to drive to the city stadium parking lot to plan their next move. But on the way, the car owner suddenly sat up. In that terrifying moment, they realized the victim was still alive. Panicked and frightened, Guoli and Diendong immediately drew their knives, frantically stabbing the victim repeatedly until he lay completely motionless in his seat. The atmosphere in the car became suffocating, with the heavy smell of blood mixed with sweat. An eerie silence fell over them, no one daring to speak, each lost in their own thoughts about the crime they had just committed. When they reached the parking lot, Lin stopped the car, and following Tianyong's careful instructions, the group began eliminating evidence. They meticulously wiped every surface that could leave fingerprints, from seats to door handles, and collected all items that could lead to clues. Before leaving, they discovered 20,000 yuan, about $2,400, in cash in a travel bag on the back seat. This was quite a prize. When the group reconvened, Tianyong noticed something unsettling in his accomplice's eyes and attitudes. As the most experienced member, he understood that the first kill had left significant psychological trauma on these novice criminals. With a leader's instinct, Tianyong decided to let the group take the stolen money to Dali to spend and relieve their stress. Tianyong's decision achieved its desired effect. After the trip and spending all the stolen money, the young criminals seemed reborn. Their fear and guilt about killing were gradually replaced by excitement about how easily they had acquired money. While his accomplices were absorbed in their pleasures, Tianyong had already begun planning their next crimes. "We need to get guns," Tianyong told Lin during one meeting. Lin pondered deeply, as acquiring a gun wouldn't be simple. Perhaps they would have to steal one from the police. This idea seemed too risky and dangerous. After asking around, Lin learned that many state-owned factory security departments were equipped with guns at that time. He began calculating in his head. He went to Chuxiang, about 100 kilometers from Kunming, stalked around a factory for several days, and finally identified a target. It was someone named Zhou Guoxiang, deputy chief of security, who regularly carried a Type 54 pistol. Lin returned to Kunming and discussed the gun-stealing plan with Tian Yong. At this point, Tian Yong came up with a strategy. He wanted his accomplices to pose as police officers to make Guoxiang fall into their trap. On the evening of June 23, 1997, the group spotted a jeep with Guizhou plates at a Kunming hospital. They chose the right moment to steal the car and immediately replaced it with prepared local plates. This is also why, even though the car owner reported it immediately, the police couldn't find any leads. To ensure the gun robbery in Lufeng would be absolutely successful, Tian Yong spent over 10 days preparing everyone. He found several police uniforms for everyone to wear. As a former police officer, Tian Yong even trained them in how to talk and walk like police officers, including proper formal salutes. On July 10th, the group drove their stolen jeep to Lufeng City, following security chief Guoxiang. Waiting until the area was deserted, their car accelerated and stopped in front of Guoxiang. Lin, sitting in the passenger seat, lowered the window and said to Guoxiang outside, "Hello, comrade. Someone from our unit has fled with public funds. We've investigated and found that his girlfriend lives nearby. Could you help us by coming to the police station to provide more information?" Guoxiang stood there, his eyes scanning over the car before settling on Lin. At that moment, the back window slowly lowered, revealing Tian Yong and Guoli sitting in the back seat. When Guoxiang saw Tian Yong wearing a major's uniform, he immediately felt respect. Without any suspicion, he got into their car to show them the way. Lin, with fake friendliness, pulled out a cigarette to offer Guoxiang. In the moment when the victim was completely relaxed, Guoli used a dagger from behind to stab him in the chest. Guoxiang's first reaction was to reach for his gun, but it was too late. Lin in the front seat immediately turned and stabbed him as well. The two coordinated, one from front and one from behind, stabbing dozens of times until the victim stopped breathing. Tian Yong, wearing gloves, took the Type 54 pistol from Guoxiang's belt, along with a magazine and 13 bullets. At this moment, Tian Yong felt extremely excited because he was very familiar with this Type 54 pistol. Whether during his time in the military or later at the Railway Bureau, he had used this type of gun. He knew its power well, and this gun would later become these criminals' most important tool for their crimes. That night, they drove out of the city and stopped at a hillside on National Highway 320, pushing Guoxiang's body down the slope. 5 days later, a farmer accidentally discovered it and reported to the police. When police arrived at the scene, they identified the victim as Zhou Guoxiang, who had been stabbed 24 times. The dagger used in the crime was found near the body, but no fingerprints could be collected. The only thing that could be determined from the wounds was that there were 2 to 3 perpetrators. But that was all the police could gather. In an era without surveillance cameras and networked systems, the investigation faced countless difficulties. No witnesses, no electronic traces, no other clues. The case hit a dead end. The limitations of technology and investigative tools had inadvertently created a void for criminals to operate freely. From then on, Tian Yong and his accomplices grew increasingly bold. This successful operation had brought great confidence to Tian Yong's gang. Moreover, they discovered that impersonating military personnel wasn't just a tool to easily approach victims. It also gave them a special sense of power. In the role of law enforcement officers, they could order, threaten, and control their victims. From here, they embarked on a frenzied path of car theft, murder, and robbery. To look more like police officers, they even managed to obtain handcuffs and forged documents. They became increasingly addicted to these roles. Once, Tian Yong and his accomplices went to Kunming's famous auto parts street. Since their main income came from selling stolen cars, they wanted to check if there were any opportunities. While wandering around, their eyes suddenly lit up when they saw an orange Mitsubishi Pajero parked there. This Japanese model was very popular, and in the 90s, imported cars were rare and extremely expensive. At that time, Lin stepped forward, waving a fake ID in front of the driver's face, and said, "We're police officers. Someone has reported that your car is from an illegal source. Please come with us to assist with the investigation." Before the driver could explain, Lin had already handcuffed him and pushed him into the car. Afterward, they drove to a secluded location, and Lin called Tianyong to come. Tianyong professionally pretended to take the driver's statement. Through conversation, they learned that this person was named Dao Guoqing, a driver for government officials. He was driving around because his leader was in a meeting. The reason Tianyong took his statement was to investigate the victim's financial situation. If he was very wealthy, they might be able to extort more. However, Guoqing gradually realized something was wrong with the people in the car. When he tried to struggle and escape from the car, Tianyong and Ming Chai immediately grabbed his arms and legs from both ends, while Guoli strangled him. Within minutes, the victim had stopped breathing. Finally, they threw his body into a dry well. Afterward, Tianyong arranged for 2 people to drive the stolen car straight to Shenyang to sell. The car ended up selling for 190,000 yuan, about $23,000. Having a lot of money was certainly good, but money often brings trouble. Tianyong was naturally very careful. He thought that with 7 members in the group, each could develop their own ambitions and desires, which could lead to the organization's collapse. As a former police officer, Tianyong understood that controlling internal affairs was just as important as dealing with external threats. Everyone in the group called Tianyong political commissar and called Lin commander. These 2 were the core figures of the gang. Tianyong had set many rules, such as how to divide the money. He also made each member write down detailed family circumstances, relatives' lists, and lock them in a safe. This was actually to prevent anyone from betraying their brothers. After all, no one would dare risk their relatives' lives. Therefore, Tianyong not only had a sense of counter-investigation against outsiders, but also kept a tight grip on the gang members. His behavior became increasingly arrogant and reckless. Very soon after, they committed a major crime that shocked the entire country. One day in April 1998, Tianyong heard people say that recently in the evenings near the cable car station at Western Mountain Tourist Area in Kunming, there were often small cars parked. Inside the cars were couples taking advantage of the darkness for dating, and one thing was certain, people who could drive there weren't poor. Tianyong thought that their group could continue using their police impersonation scheme for extortion. Around 8 p.m. that evening, Tianyong brought his tools and handcuffs, along with several accomplices, to the predetermined location. They walked around for a while and discovered a blue Changhe van. There were no other cars around, making it very convenient for them to act. When they approached and looked inside, they saw a man and woman embracing in the back seat. Tianyong knocked on the car window. When the window lowered, the 2 people inside looked surprised. Tianyong, as usual, presented his fake narcotics police ID, saying he suspected them of using drugs. The couple in the car immediately tried to explain. Unexpectedly, these fake police met real police. It turned out this couple were also police officers. The woman was named Wang Xiaoxiang, an employee of the Information Department of the Kunming City Police Bureau, and the man was Wang Junbo, deputy chief of the Lunnan County Police Bureau. When hearing this, Tianyong wasn't frightened at all, but instead turned to Mingkai and Dian Dong, who were behind him, and said, "Handcuff them." The couple in the car were confused, not understanding what was happening. No matter how Xiaoxiang and Junbo tried to explain, Tianyong had no intention of stopping. Xiaoxiang took out her phone, but before she could dial, Dian Dong snatched it away. Junbo then shouted loudly and tried to struggle, his handcuffed hand moving toward his waist. Seeing this, Tianyong quickly intervened, repeatedly slapping Junbo's face hard until he was nearly unconscious. Tianyong knew for sure Junbo had a gun at his waist. Indeed, it was a Type 77. This Type 77 pistol, compared to his Type 54, was more compact and lighter, with the main feature being that it could be loaded with one hand. He picked up the gun and immediately shot Junbo in the heart. Then 2 more bang-bang sounds rang out, and 2 more victims lost their lives. Killing 2 police officers wasn't a small matter. Tianyong knew they had to quickly dispose of the 2 bodies, or there would be trouble. This was a government vehicle, too conspicuous for them to drive away. Therefore, they took all belongings from the victims, tried to erase as many traces as possible from the car, and then parked both the bodies and car in front of a nearby company's gate. After finishing this, Tianyong wasn't feeling very comfortable, because after all, he had taken a gun from a deputy police chief. Sure enough, the case of 2 murdered police officers not only shocked the local area, but quickly spread across the entire country. Who would dare to be so bold as to kill police officers? The police naturally had to investigate thoroughly. Tianyong's group decided to temporarily lay low and look for a chance to escape. But before they could run, he received news. Not only had the police not found them, but they had quickly identified a suspect named Du Pei-Wu. Even Tianyong wondered who Pei-Wu was. It turned out Pei-Wu was the husband of the female officer Xiao Xiang, and also a police officer working at the Kunming Drug Rehabilitation Center, who suddenly became the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. The police seemed to have rushed to build a theory about the motive. An enraged husband who discovered his wife's affair had taken revenge brutally. However, Pei-Wu insisted he had an alibi. On the night of the murders, he was working at the rehabilitation center, and there were even witnesses. But the police didn't believe him and stubbornly clung to one point. Normally, ordinary people couldn't easily make a deputy police chief surrender his gun. But if the perpetrator at the scene was Pei-Wu, this situation could occur. Finally, although they never found the most important piece of evidence, the missing gun, in February 1999, Pei-Wu was convicted of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. He appealed, and his sentence was reduced to death with reprieve, barely saving his life. It wasn't until Tianyong's criminal gang was caught that Pei-Wu was finally exonerated. The Pei-Wu case became one of the largest wrongful conviction cases in Chinese criminal justice history. Later investigation revealed that he had been severely tortured to obtain a confession. If he had actually been executed then, it would have truly been a grave injustice. After the shocking case of the two murdered police officers, Tianyong's psychology changed. First, he felt unhappy because he had initially thought he could use the stolen Type 77 pistol later, but then he realized this gun was an important link in the case. Once its use was discovered, their crimes could be exposed. Therefore, this gun could only be locked in the safe. The group's motives for action were no longer simply theft and robbery. They had completely transformed into demons, killing innocent people indiscriminately. Once, Ming Tai and Dian Dong were walking down the street when they saw a beautiful girl, dragged her into their car, raped her, then killed her to silence her, afterward throwing her body into a drainage ditch. The gang leader Tianyong wasn't unconcerned about his brothers doing this, but he worried that carelessly disposing of bodies like this would eventually lead to mistakes. If police found some evidence on them, everything would be over. At that time, Tianyong was moving house. To deceive people, he rented 2 farms for livestock in the east and west areas. He stayed in the east, while Lin stayed in the west. The farms outwardly raised dozens of pigs and wolves, but in reality, they had become their base for future crimes. Because Tianyong had thought of a way to dispose of bodies that he was sure no one could ever discover. By March 1999, Tianyong's group was looking for targets on the road when they spotted a black Nissan Gloria. They waited until dark to execute their plan. At this time, a man and woman were getting into the car. Tianyong used their usual method, knocking on the window with his police identity, then successfully brought both people and car to the East Farm. Afterward, they killed these 2 victims, then assigned people to drive the car to Shenyang to sell. Along the way, they planned to dispose of the 2 victims' bodies, but Tianyong suddenly proposed a brutal idea. Why don't we feed them to the pigs and dogs? Hearing this, the others looked at each other in doubt. Although each of them already had blood on their hands, no one dared to step forward to do this. Therefore, Tianyong had to do it himself, but he required everyone to stand beside him and watch him complete this task. After dismembering the victims, he put the bones and flesh into a large pot to cook, then poured it into the animals' feeding troughs. Lin's younger brother Shaoli, the youngest in the group, after witnessing the entire process, vomited on the spot and developed a high fever. Tianyong said he wanted everyone to get used to these scenes to become more daring. Their group had transformed into Satan-like demons, continuing to carry out savage massacres afterward. Subsequently, 10 more people were brutally murdered, all disposed of in the same way. These innocent lives vanished from the earth as if they had evaporated and naturally left no clues behind. Tianyong had trained 6 butchers who had lost their humanity, and they believed that each of their crimes was perfect with flawless coordination. So could they escape the law forever? After 2000, Tianyong and his accomplices' methods escalated once again. They directly impersonated traffic police, setting up checkpoints on the road. Ordinary people usually didn't dare doubt police identity, especially in broad daylight. Their uniforms and way of speaking never made people think they were fake police. On the evening of April 23rd, the group stopped a Mitsubishi car by the road. The person sitting in the car looked like a wealthy businessman, wearing gold rings, gold necklaces, and expensive watches. Tianyong didn't say much, directly killing the man. This operation again earned them a large sum of money. Everything seemed perfect, but there was an unexpected secret slip-up. When searching the wealthy man's body, Gwilly found a very thin and compact mobile phone. He secretly kept it without anyone knowing. When he got home, he discovered it was the newest Motorola PHY-998 flip phone, which had just been released and cost over 10,000 yuan, about $1,200. Gwilly was short on money at the time, and he had a girlfriend who suggested selling the phone for cash. Gwilly cautiously waited 2 months before taking the phone to a pawn shop. The shop owner asked him to turn on the phone to check if it worked well. After turning it on, the pawn shop owner made a test call. This action led to the complete exposure of Tianyong's group. After the wealthy man's disappearance case was filed for investigation, police had begun tracking the signal from this phone. When the phone was turned on, its location was quickly discovered. Chai Gwilly was caught on the spot. At the police station, he initially tried to lie and make excuses. But experienced police officers recognized that he had a weak will, so they applied rotating interrogation tactics. After nearly a week of continuous questioning without rest, Gwilly couldn't take it anymore and decided to voluntarily confess, hoping to gain a chance for a reduced sentence. Thus, police heard from Gwilly's own mouth about all the crimes they had committed from 1997 to May 2000. During the confession, the criminal investigators had to take deep breaths, their scalps going numb. A series of disappearances in Kunming over many years was finally solved. Particularly, the high-profile case of 2 murdered police officers took an unexpected turn. Du Pei-Wu, who had been sentenced to death with reprieve, was soon freed as innocent, causing a public sensation. And the criminal gang led by Tianyong was finally not far from facing legal punishment. Police initially thought catching a cunning Tianyong with strong anti-investigation awareness would surely be a difficult challenge. But unexpectedly, the entire arrest process was very smooth. Police took less than a week to capture the remaining 6 gang members. On the day they arrested Tianyong, knowing he had 2 guns, police mobilized over 100 officers. But in the end, Tianyong didn't resist at all. Long ago, he had told his brothers that once caught, resistance was useless, just keeping one's life was enough. And he truly did just that. On October 25, 2000, the Kunming Intermediate People's Court conducted the first trial of Tianyong's murder and robbery case. All 7 gang members, including Yang Tianyong, were sentenced to death. When the verdict was announced, sobbing sounds erupted from the public gallery. These were the relatives of the 19 innocent victims. On the morning of November 17, 2000, the Kunming Intermediate People's Court announced at the city stadium that the 7 criminals from Yang Tianyong's murder and robbery gang would be taken to the execution ground to carry out their sentences. With this, the most violent criminal gang in Yunnan since its establishment was finally eliminated. Story 2. On a fateful August night in 1982, gunshots shattered the peaceful silence around a campfire at Wells Gray Provincial Park in Canada. As panic and screams filled the air, sisters Karen and Janet caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure approaching their tent. Moments later, they vanished without a trace. For months, Canadian authorities believed they had been killed along with their family. However, the truth behind this case would prove far more horrifying. Our story takes place in British Columbia, Canada's westernmost province, known for its ancient forests, majestic waterfalls, pristine lakes, and towering mountain ranges. Drawn to this natural beauty, the Johnson family chose Wells Gray as their summer vacation destination. They sought peace and tranquility amid the wilderness. The Johnson family consisted of Bob, 44, and Jackie, 41, along with their 2 beloved daughters, Janet, 13, and Karen, 11. The story begins on Monday, August 11, 1982. The Johnsons embarked on their camping trip, meeting Jackie's parents, George and Edith Bentley, who were waiting in their RV near the park entrance. They decided to set up camp at Face Christ, a remote area about 11 miles south of the park entrance, seeking privacy. While George, Edith, Bob, and Jackie settled into the RV's comfort, Janet and Karen were thrilled with their small tent outside. Wells Gray Provincial Park stretched endlessly before them, promising adventure and discovery. But in those peaceful moments, none could have predicted the tragedy lurking ahead. What should have been a wilderness paradise would soon become a scene of unimaginable horror when a deranged killer appeared, armed and ready to strike. In a single night, the Johnson family vanished without a trace. As if they had never existed, no clues, no messages, no calls left behind. On August 23, 1982, when Bob was supposed to return to work, his employer, Mr. Bonus, became concerned about his unprecedented absence. He immediately reported it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. The situation was particularly suspicious because everyone knew Bob is incredibly reliable. In his 25 years of employment, he had never taken leave without proper justification, not even calling in sick once. Upon receiving the report, Canadian authorities launched a large-scale investigation. They meticulously interviewed family members and friends of the Johnson family. Through these interviews, investigators established a final timeline. August 6th was the family's last contact before beginning their ill-fated vacation. After that, as if a dark curtain had fallen, all communication ceased. The investigation team faced a perplexing question. How could a family of 6, along with a car and a bulky RV, vanish without a trace in the vast Wells Gray Provincial Park? Despite its size, the disappearance of such a large group with vehicles seemed impossible to explain. This wasn't the case of a single missing person. This was an entire family with transportation, all vanishing mysteriously. A massive search operation was immediately launched with the help of volunteers and modern equipment. Law enforcement combed through every corner of the park. However, after days of searching, there were still no signs of the Johnson family. When interviewing local gas station employees, police learned that the Johnsons had appeared to be in good spirits when fueling up before entering the park, with the daughters laughing and showing no signs of distress. This made the case even more puzzling. In 1982, before the advent of GPS technology and mobile phones, searching for a missing family in the vast wilderness of Wells Gray presented an enormous challenge. The search team had to consider all possibilities from an accident on the winding mountain roads, to getting lost in the remote wilderness, to the heartbreaking possibility that their vehicle had plunged into one of the park's deep ravines. Then, on September 13th, a breakthrough occurred when someone contacted authorities reporting the discovery of a burned-out car while mushroom hunting in the park. The vehicle was later identified as belonging to the Johnson family. When Sergeant Mike Easton and his investigation team arrived at the scene, they were struck by the overwhelming smell of burnt metal and rubber. Mike would later recall that the atmosphere carried an indescribable sense of foreboding, as if nature itself was whispering about the horrific crime waiting to be uncovered. Before them, Johnson's car was now just a blackened wreck, a twisted metal frame deformed by intense heat. The windows were shattered, door handles melted like tar, and the 4 tires were nothing but charred rubber. They also found 6.22 caliber shell casings scattered around the campsite. Nearby were 2 pointed sticks, apparently used by the children for roasting marshmallows. However, George's vehicle and equipment were nowhere to be found. As they examined the scene more closely, an even more horrifying truth awaited the investigation team. The car wasn't just a burned-out shell inside, were the tragic remains that exceeded human imagination. Preliminary reports indicated someone had been burned in the back seat. When investigators managed to open the deformed doors, a horrifying sight greeted them: charred skeletons, 2 small skulls lying bare. Immediately, the investigators' thoughts turned to Karen and Janet, the Johnson family's little angels. Sergeant Mike Easton, who directly participated in examining the crime scene, couldn't maintain his composure at the sight. With a choked voice, he later recounted, "Even though we had prepared ourselves for the worst, what we witnessed still made us shudder. Before me, the 2 children were now just withered skeletons, with deep eye sockets seeming to look at us hopelessly. What haunted me even more was discovering what appeared to be a fatal gunshot wound on one of the skulls. Detailed forensic examination of the discovered bones revealed a heartbreaking truth. The bodies in the car belonged to the entire Johnson family, parents, and 2 daughters. However, the initial absence of George and Edith's remains among the wreckage led to dark theories. Some began to suspect George, suggesting he might have been caught in an inappropriate act with Karen or Janet and resorted to violence to cover it up. These suspicions were quickly dispelled when investigators announced their findings. They had discovered DNA from 6 different victims, along with 6 skulls in the vehicle. Experts explained that the initial inability to find some bone fragments in the first report was likely due to wild animals carrying them away during the extended period the car lay in the forest. This also explained why investigators initially only reported finding 4 sets of remains. What had started as a mysterious disappearance had now become a horrifying and complex murder case. The Johnsons were well liked by everyone, and their deaths left profound grief among their loved ones. In a desperate attempt to catch the killer, investigators even filmed the funeral, hoping the perpetrator might appear to witness the consequences of their crime. However, this tactic failed to yield results. As the investigation deepened, forensic experts uncovered increasingly disturbing details. Finding multiple bodies with gunshot wounds not only confirmed this was a premeditated murder, but also revealed the killer's brutality. Through analyzing evidence and reconstructing the crime scene, investigators theorized that the killer's motive likely stemmed from a perverted desire targeting Karen and Janet. This wasn't simply a robbery murder, but a crime planned with darker, more horrifying motives. The family's isolation had inadvertently created perfect conditions for tragedy. During the first 2 nights, Jackie had repeatedly expressed concern about feeling watched by unseen eyes. The sudden appearance of broken branches and unexplained movement in the bushes increased the young mother's unease. Jackie's premonitions proved tragically accurate. A predator was indeed stalking the family, with lustful eyes fixed on Janet and Karen. On that fateful night, when thick darkness enveloped the forest with only the flickering campfire illuminating their faces, no one knew that a dark figure was slowly approaching them. The killer's eyes blazed in the darkness like flames of hatred, choosing this moment to commit his savage crime. His skillful movement in the darkness showed he was very familiar with the terrain, likely having stalked this family many times before. And then, while the family gathered around the warm fire, the predator decided to strike. Being a local resident, he had chosen the perfect moment to attack his unsuspecting victims. Using the cover of darkness, he crept from the bushes toward the family with a rifle. Janet and Karen had gone to sleep in their tent, so he focused on the others. He wanted to isolate the victims, giving them no chance to escape. With slow, deliberate steps and precise shots, he ended the lives of Bob, Jackie, George, and Edith. The gunshots suddenly cut through the peaceful atmosphere, giving none of them time to react. There may have been screams echoing through the night, but no one heard them. After dealing with the Johnson family adults, the predator approached the tent where Janet and Karen were resting. Whether he kept the girls alive for several days, or held them somewhere, remains unclear. What is certain is that after committing the murders, he used the family's vehicle to transport the bodies. One crucial aspect that needed clarification was when the Johnson family's car was burned. Although they had been missing for over a month before the discovery, if the motive was to abuse Janet and Karen, they might have been held captive for longer. Determining when the car was burned would help police narrow down their investigation. However, the police investigation had hit a dead end. Local public opinion strongly criticized investigators for seemingly focusing only on finding the remaining RV while the murders remained unsolved. Many believed the killer had stolen the vehicle to dispose of evidence and escape. The stolen vehicle theory had led the investigation astray. Search operations in the park were gradually reduced to make way for tracking down the missing RV. But to date, all efforts had been futile. To find leads, police launched a major media campaign. Posters describing the missing RV were posted everywhere from stores to billboards. They even created an exact model of the victim's vehicle and displayed it widely for public recognition. Television stations also joined the search by broadcasting reenactments of the killer's possible route. To solve the case quickly, police made widespread appeals for information from the public. One of the most noteworthy leads came from a witness living about a 12-hour drive from the crime scene in Saskatchewan. This person claimed to have seen the victim's RV with 2 young men inside. According to the witness's description, these 2 men had distinctive appearances, were around 20 years old, dressed shabbily, had long hair, and could speak French. One had blonde hair, the other black. Based on this testimony, police created sketches of the 2 suspects and distributed them widely through the media. Finally, in October 1983, more than a year after the murders, an unexpected breakthrough occurred. A park ranger had accidentally discovered the RV the police were searching for. He contacted authorities, reporting that he had found the vehicle on a small mountain within the park. Notably, the RV had been completely burned, and this location was less than 19 miles from where the Johnson family was murdered. This discovery completely upended the investigation. Clearly, the RV had never been stolen as the police had initially theorized. Instead, it had been driven deep into the forest and burned there. At this point, police were criticized for initiating an expensive nationwide chase while the RV had been lying just a short distance from the murder scene all year. With this new evidence, investigators were forced to review the entire case from the beginning. The choice of location to dispose of the vehicle in a remote, secluded forest area was no coincidence. It was a place few people knew about, far from regular tourist routes. This suggested the perpetrator was likely a local resident. The scope of investigation was narrowing, focusing on the small towns and villages surrounding Wells Gray Park, where the population had never exceeded 1,000 people. If any suspicious behavior had occurred in the past year, someone would surely have noticed. In such a small community, everyone knew each other, and any unusual activity would be easily detected. Starting with the area around Wells Gray Park, the investigation quickly uncovered a significant lead. A woman living near the crime scene revealed that the previous year, a man named David Shearing had attempted to change the registration of his Ford vehicle and wanted to repair a bullet hole in the door. This information raised suspicions about David Shearing's connection to the massacre. Although the investigation team couldn't rush to conclude that David was the killer, he was clearly a person of interest who needed thorough investigation. Before taking further steps, Sergeant Mike decided to carefully examine David's background. Could an ordinary man suddenly become a mass murderer, killing 6 members of a family? David Shearing was 24 years old, a young man who grew up in the peaceful countryside, connected to his family's cattle ranch. On the surface, David was an excellent student with special talents in mathematics and mechanical engineering. But behind that intelligence was a lonely soul. He rarely socialized, lived in isolation, and had very few friends. The rare occasions when he emerged from his shell were at dances or movie theaters, brief opportunities to integrate into the outside world. After graduating in 1977, David worked various jobs. Finally, he decided to pursue his passion for mechanics. However, his life was completely disrupted when his father, who had always supported his passion, died of a heart attack. His father's passing left David with deep emotional wounds. Leaving the family ranch, he moved to a small Canadian town that was in a development phase. There, he quickly found employment. However, instead of using his job to build legitimate wealth, David gradually fell into a life of crime. Taking advantage of his contractor's trust, he secretly stole construction materials, accumulating them to build his own log cabin on the outskirts of town. From there, a criminal life began to infiltrate and completely change him. By September 1983, David and his accomplices were caught red-handed, transporting a large quantity of stolen materials. From then on, his life was placed under strict police surveillance, from having to report regularly to facing a criminal record. But this incident inadvertently opened up an important clue to another horrific case. When investigators began tracking David's trail, they discovered a notable detail. At the time of the Johnson family tragedy at Wells Gray Provincial Park in 1982, David was renting a suspicious large house in the area. The location of this house was not only close to the crime scene, but also within range of where the burned vehicles were found. This coincidence, along with David's recent criminal behavior, pushed him onto the suspect list. Subsequently, Sergeant Mike decided to dig deeper into David's past to find incriminating evidence. During the investigation, he discovered a case from 3 years ago in 1981, when a man named Cather was murdered near Wells Gray Provincial Park. Notably, the road where the murder occurred was the same road that David frequently traveled with his colleagues. With this information, Sergeant Mike believed this was an important lead and decided to begin interrogation with the old case. On November 19, 1983, David Shearing was summoned by Sergeant Mike. In the stifling interrogation room, the sergeant's sharp gaze seemed to pierce through the suspect's soul. With sophisticated interrogation tactics, he didn't go straight to the Johnson case but started with another incident. "David, let's examine an old case together, the cause of Cather's death in 1980. Faced with the experienced investigator, David tried to stay calm with a deep breath before letting his first confessions flow. He told about a fateful rainy night when alcohol clouded his judgment and he lost control of his vehicle and hit Cather. In extreme panic, he fled the scene and, along with his colleague, swore to keep this dark secret. In reality, in all reports and even newspaper articles, there was no mention of the victim dying from a car accident. Sergeant Mike had done his job well to get the perpetrator to detail the accident process. The sergeant continued speaking to David. I want to talk to you about the Johnson family murders at Wells Gray Provincial Park. Do you know where they were shot? David replied, yes, they were shot near the Old Creek campground, the worst area. Surprisingly, this information had never appeared in the press. No source had ever revealed the exact location where the Johnson family was murdered. Now the killer had revealed information proving he was directly involved in the case. In the suffocating interrogation room, David, with empty eyes, admitted everything. Tears rolling down his cheeks marked the beginning of a horrifying confession. When cornered, he began recounting every terrifying detail of the crimes he had committed. One night in August 1982, David had accidentally spotted the Johnson family's RV, the area where they were staying, and that RV had made him curious because their stopping point was usually unknown to tourists. He snuck into the forest, hiding behind thick bushes, observing the Johnson family gathered around the fire. However, a small noise made them aware of his presence. Feeling scared, David quickly retreated. The idea of an RV full of valuable possessions kept haunting his mind, compelling him to possess it. The next day, David took his rifle and returned to the campsite. There, David loaded his rifle while still observing the Johnson family. After seeing the couple's 2 daughters head to their tent, he emerged from the bushes and carried out a shooting spree at midnight. He had no trouble shooting Bob, Jackie, George, and Edith. Though they tried their best to protect themselves from the bullets, they were successively shot and fatally wounded. Bob, unfortunately moaning too loudly in his final moments, was shot multiple times by David, leading to his death. Not stopping there, the killer continued toward the tent, trying to open it while Janet and Karen were terrified inside. They had heard their mother's screams, a gunshot, and then heavy silence enveloping the campsite. Then he opened the tent, went inside, and attacked the 2 sisters. The killer confessed that after committing the murders, he placed the bodies of all 6 family members in the car, with adults in the back seat and Karen and Janet in the trunk. He then stole some valuable belongings from the family, hid the car in the forest, and drove it home. The next day, he returned to the scene with 4 gallons of gasoline, drove the car to the location where it was discovered in early September, and set it on fire with the victims inside. As for the RV, he quickly realized that without proper documentation, it would be difficult to register it in his name and resell it, so he decided to burn it in the park as well. Sergeant Mike was skeptical of David's confessions. He sensed there was something deeper behind this massacre than just theft. The murder of an entire family of 6 for an RV seems inexplicable. With a rifle and a hood, the perpetrator could have easily taken the vehicle and valuables and disappeared without committing such brutal acts. Clearly, the motive behind the Johnson family massacre held darker secrets than a typical robbery. Initially, David tried to justify his actions by claiming they resulted from panic during the robbery. However, this explanation seemed unconvincing. Finally, Judge Mark Key stated during sentencing, "This is a savage case, an unforgivable act of cruelty." The defendant took the lives of 6 innocent people, a happy family, in a cold and calculated action. The Bentleys at their respectable age were enjoying their retirement with family. The Johnsons in their middle age were nurturing their home and raising children. 2 young girls with dreams and aspirations had their bright futures stolen. The scene at the campsite that day was horrific. A family enjoying warm moments together suddenly became the scene of a terrible massacre. The victims, completely surprised and defenseless, were brutally robbed of their lives. The defendant David, with selfish motives and unbridled greed, didn't hesitate to murder innocent people. The defendant's actions were not just a crime, but an offense against humanity. Finally, the court sentenced David Shearing to life imprisonment. This punishment could never compensate for the enormous losses the victims' families had suffered, but it was the harshest penalty the law could apply to deter and protect society from such brutal acts. David was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But Sergeant Mike believed that wasn't the real motive for the massacre. Therefore, after the sentencing, he visited the killer and proposed an interview, promising to support his future parole application. David, with a glimmer of hope, agreed. However, the sergeant quickly made it clear that David's cooperation was a prerequisite. He affirmed that the police had irrefutable evidence about what David had done to Karen and Janet. These would only be revealed in this interview, and as long as David denied it, his chance of freedom would remain distant. It's heartbreaking to think that Janet and Karen, 2 innocent young girls, had to endure ultimate suffering during that time. What remained of them were only traces of a tragic end. While the perpetrator might try to escape punishment, the images of the two young girls still haunted investigators. Finally, David revealed in the interview that he began having violent sexual fantasies as a teenager when he saw Karen and Janet. The clear motive wasn't the RV theft, but his attraction to Karen and Janet. The urge was so strong that he couldn't resist when he saw the family appear in the secluded location. David recounted the crime details similarly to before leaving and returning with weapons. There, the killer dealt with everyone, but instead of harming Karen and Janet when they went toward the tent, he explained to them that something very serious had happened, that their parents had been attacked by bad people, that they needed to stay in the tent without making any noise. While David hid their grandparents and parents in the car, Janet and Karen waited in the tent. After finishing everything, the predator led the two young girls out through the forest. The girls were still too frightened to speak, haunted by their mother's cries and then the gunshots in their minds. David knew the area well and knew that a bit further there was an abandoned fishing cabin. He ordered the girls inside first, then locked the door, where he sexually assaulted them. The sisters stayed in that wooden house for several days. Janet even carved her initials there, which were later discovered. The two sisters were terrified. Even when they spotted a prison guard observing a group of inmates near the river, they didn't dare make any sound to signal for help, fearing David would kill them. After several days in the cabin, David decided to take the girls to his small farm not far away for better security. He knew the search might soon begin and didn't want to stay when investigators started looking for the Johnson family, so he decided to move the girls out of there. The entire reason for these cruel acts was purely desire. At David's house, Janet and Karen were repeatedly assaulted by this predator until late August, when David realized he couldn't keep the girls alive any longer. Karen was the first to be taken into the forest. While her sister was locked in a room at the farm about 100 yards into the woods, David ordered Karen to stop, raised his gun, and aimed. After taking Karen's life, he brought her body to place in the stolen car, then went for Janet. The girl understood something had happened to her sister, and that she would face the same fate. Afterward, David tried to use the victims' names to sell the vehicle but feared detection, so he decided to burn it. That's why the incident was only discovered almost a month after it occurred. Later, killer David Shearing changed his name to David Ennis. He applied for parole in September 2008, but the parole board ruled that he still posed a danger to others and couldn't return to freedom due to his violent actions. In 2021, David's parole was again denied, and he remains imprisoned to this day. On August 25, 2016, in a peaceful Toronto suburb, a horrifying event unfolded. Police cordoned off the entire area after receiving multiple calls reporting a shocking attack. According to witnesses, a severely injured young man lay motionless on the street with an arrow lodged in his neck. Additionally, another man had managed to escape despite sustaining serious head injuries. He was the one who revealed that a massacre was taking place inside the house. This news stunned neighbors because the Ryan family was known for being gentle, humble people who had never caused any trouble in the area. The Ryan family, with 6 members, had once been a model of domestic happiness. Susan was a dynamic and passionate woman who had raised 4 sons with warm love. Her husband Bill was the budget director of the Toronto Star, one of Canada's largest newspapers. Beyond his work, Bill was known as an active person who regularly taught fitness classes at the community center. The Ryan family had 4 sons. The eldest, Christopher, worked as a ticket agent at a public transportation company. Despite interacting with many people daily, Christopher maintained a quiet, rather shy personality, preferring solitude to lively conversations. The third brother, Lee, was a talented individual with a passion for music, enjoying both guitar and drums. At the time, Lee was studying photography at Royalston School. The youngest brother, Alexander, though only 20 years old, had already achieved considerable success. He was attending a prestigious private school and was the family's pride. The second brother, Brett, was a vibrant young man with striking looks. He enjoyed performing in front of crowds, an extrovert with the ability to energize any atmosphere. However, behind that glamorous exterior lay sudden bouts of depression. Past trauma had left scars in his heart that were difficult to heal. Nevertheless, he remained a passionate man, ready to contribute to the community. In 2007, at age 26, Brett felt lost and lonely amid the hustle of life. His life then was like a gray painting, uncertain about the future. He decided to drop out of university. After several months of aimlessness, he had accumulated $60,000 in debt. To make a living, he accepted a terrible job that left him dissatisfied and even somewhat ashamed. Comparing himself to his successful friends and family expectations, he felt utterly inadequate. Each morning when facing his reflection in the mirror, Brett saw himself as a failure. The debts drove him to desperation. Despite these difficulties, he still tried to maintain a glamorous exterior by purchasing expensive items. The truth was, he was trying to prove himself, wanting to be admired by others. In desperation, Brett conceived an outrageous idea, robbing banks. By October 2007, when he saw no way out, he decided to execute this bold plan. He wasn't a cold-blooded criminal. Deep down, he still had a conscience. When thinking about going to prison and disappointing his parents, he felt conflicted. Therefore, Brett decided to carry out a robbery without causing injury to anyone, hoping to minimize risks and consequences. On October 20th, Brett disguised himself as an injured person by wrapping bandages around his face and wearing an arm sling. With this new appearance, he entered bank number 371 on Kingston Road, a location just an 8-minute walk from his home for a quick escape. There, instead of threatening customers, Brett tried to create the image of an injured person coming to the bank to claim insurance money. At the counter, Brett handed the teller a note with a brief demand. "Robbery, no alarm. Give me $2,000. I have a weapon." Despite trying to stay calm, the teller couldn't help but panic at the unexpected situation. With their modest salary and fear for their life, they complied with the demand, taking $1,115 from their drawer and stammering, "This is all I have." Brett silently took the money, maintaining composure, then turned and walked away, slowly limping out of the bank without any interference from security guards or surrounding customers. At that moment, no one could have guessed that the 26-year-old had just committed his first robbery in life, earning merely $1,115. Back in his apartment, Brett couldn't help but wonder why they stopped at $1,115. Determined to earn more in the next robbery, he chose a completely new image, an elderly man with gray hair and beard, wearing glasses and a hat. With this careful disguise, Brett believed he would easily deceive everyone. His strategy remained the same, a brief note with demands, get the money, and leave quickly. The second robbery was another complete success. However, for Brett, this was just the beginning, as the desire for more money increasingly compelled him to carry out new operations. Over 8 months, Brett continuously disguised himself as either an elderly man or an injured person to carry out non-violent robberies. Each time, he demanded a small amount of money and quickly left the scene. Bank employees had no reason to risk their lives protecting such small amounts. Moreover, the frequent rotation of counter staff made his robberies even easier. With each successful robbery, Brett earned about $3,500. In total, over 8 months, he had collected $28,000. However, the repetition of robberies at the same bank began to draw attention from authorities. They noticed something unusual. The alarm system was only activated after Brett had left. This suggested some connection between the robberies and the person triggering the alarm. Faced with this situation, the Toronto police had to increase patrols around banks in the area, hoping to catch the robber in the act. However, they faced a dilemma. How could they distinguish between a genuine elderly person and a robber disguised as one? Or how to identify a genuinely injured person from a robber pretending to be hurt? Continuous bank surveillance became meaningless when police couldn't check everyone. But then during one operation, Brett became careless when he chose a small street next to the bank to park his car, thinking there were no surveillance cameras there. Unexpectedly, a security camera had recorded his entire criminal act. After a long investigation and evidence collection, the Toronto police finally identified the perpetrator. On August 22nd, when Brett was carrying out a robbery at TD Canada Trust at 3115 Kingston Road, a small bank that had never been targeted before, he was surrounded by an elite police team. With clear images from surveillance cameras, officers easily recognized the robber and arrested him at the scene. After his arrest, Brett was detained while awaiting trial in January 2009 at the Ontario Court of Justice. For his family, especially his parents, this was an unbelievable shock. They had never faced such a serious legal situation before. The charge of bank robbery could result in a lengthy prison sentence. While awaiting the court's verdict, Brett's family continuously sent letters to the court, judge, and related judicial authorities. Their letters affirmed that Brett was inherently a good son, who had made a serious mistake due to momentary recklessness. They believed he deserved a chance to rebuild his life. The family also emphasized that they had never had any member violate the law and believed Brett had learned an expensive lesson from this mistake. They earnestly begged the court to consider reducing his punishment to give him a chance to start over. In the letter Susan and Bill sent, they revealed that Brett had gone through a period of severe depression, feeling lost and in great need of help. On his lawyer's advice, Brett decided to plead guilty to robbery and staging crime scenes to reduce his sentence. Subsequently, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. During his incarceration, he was also examined and treated by psychiatrists. Although initial psychiatric evaluations didn't detect any signs of violence, mental illness, or personality disorders in Brett, doctors still decided to monitor his psychology due to his history of severe depression. After release from prison, Brett's community reintegration process went fairly smoothly. However, the wounds from his past still left deep marks, causing Brett considerable difficulty in building and maintaining social relationships. Because Brett's part-time jobs weren't enough for him to be independent despite family support, he decided to start a small company, claiming to be an artist. However, due to his past involvement in bank robbery and the easy accessibility of this information when searching his name on social media, Brett struggled to find customers, and the company quickly had to close. Once again, he fell into unemployment and financial difficulties. Feeling lost and desperate, Brett decided to follow his mother's advice and return to university to study biophysics. At the same time, the family could no longer bear the neighbors' gossip. Therefore, they decided to move to Scarborough to start a new life. Brett's life proceeded quite peacefully until he met the love of his life. This seemingly ordinary romance would become the trigger for a series of tragic events that followed. In September 2011, through social media, Brett met and got acquainted with Kristen, a girl who frequently expressed special interest after seeing his photos. They quickly arranged their first meeting at a romantic lakeside location where Kristen owned an apartment. According to news articles, Kristen was a beautiful blonde, young, dynamic, and well-educated. She had graduated in sports physical therapy and owned a life many people dreamed of. The two quickly became a couple and regularly shared sweet moments on social media. Surprisingly, Kristen completely accepted Brett's past and showed no judgment. Their relationship seemed almost too perfect to believe. They frequently dated, went to dinner, and traveled together. Their life at this time seemed extremely happy. Brett continued his studies while dedicating time to nurturing their relationship. However, a crisis suddenly struck when Brett's father, Bill Ryan, passed away a year later. The sudden death of his father left a huge void in Brett's soul. He became closer to his mother and frequently helped her with housework. Besides studying, Brett worked part-time jobs to earn money to help the family. During the difficult months after his father's death, Brett and Kristen grew even closer. Their love helped him get through this difficult time, and then an important decision was made. Brett decided to propose to Kristen. Amid tears of happiness, Brett gave Kristen the ring. However, he was just a student without stable financial conditions to build their dream home. Kristen completely understood Brett's circumstances and was willing to wait until their finances were more stable. However, Brett decided to drop out of school to focus on earning money for the wedding. To hide dropping out, Brett created a perfect act making everyone, including Kristen, believe he had graduated from university. He forged credentials and created a perfect story to convince everyone. In 2016, Brett found a stable job at a company in Toronto. He eagerly shared this good news with Kristen and his mother. However, the joy didn't last long as Brett received an email from the company informing him that they had discovered his criminal past. Consequently, they refused to cooperate and terminated all contact. To hide the truth, Brett continued weaving a web of lies. He claimed he was still working for the company, even describing his work as remote. Kristen didn't suspect anything and completely trusted Brett's words. In fact, the concept of remote work was quite novel at that time and not widely common. However, maintaining these lies became increasingly burdensome. Brett had to spend countless hours in front of the computer screen, creating various fake evidence to prove he was working. Each passing day, his life sank deeper into stress and exhaustion, always facing the fear of his lies being exposed. Believing Brett had a stable job in Toronto, Kristen began planning for their wedding day. The wedding was set for September 16, 2016, at a very luxurious restaurant in Toronto. The couple even went house hunting together, excited about building a home for themselves. During house viewings, Brett deliberately found minor flaws to prevent Kristen from signing contracts. He knew that if Kristen became a homeowner, maintaining his lies would become increasingly difficult. Additionally, Brett worried that Kristen might accidentally inquire about his financial situation. In reality, only Brett's bank manager knew about his lies. If Kristen came to the bank with Brett, all the truth would be exposed. He feared that when the bank staff told Kristen about his unemployment, their relationship would collapse. Even Brett's mother was unaware of her son's lies. She felt concerned seeing Brett having too much free time. Nevertheless, she was always ready to help her son and trusted his promises. Brett frequently asked his mother for money to prepare for the wedding, promising to pay it back later. To hide the truth, he told his mother he was working multiple different jobs to make a living. Brett's mounting lies continued until summer 2016. Finally, unable to bear the psychological pressure, Brett sought help from a psychologist. There, he confessed everything he had done. The psychologist advised Brett to be honest with his loved ones, especially Kristen and his mother. Brett decided to meet his mother to confess everything. He shared with her that he hadn't graduated from university, didn't have a stable job, and desperately needed financial help for the wedding. However, his mother's reaction was completely opposite to what he had expected. Susan was an intelligent and kind woman. She didn't want her son to deceive a lovely girl like Kristen. Therefore, she refused to lend Brett money until he resolved matters with Kristen himself. She believed Brett needed to be honest with Kristen about his real situation and let her decide whether to continue their relationship. However, Brett didn't want to tell Kristen the truth. Finally, to continue living in deception, he decided he would kill his mother to prevent her from revealing the truth. In August 2016, Brett went to a sporting goods store and requested an inexpensive, lightweight weapon suitable for hunting. He tried to create a reasonable excuse to buy it, but his actual purpose was entirely different. The salesperson showed Brett a Banner Riser 351 crossbow, quite suitable for his limited budget. With a shooting speed of up to 93 miles per hour, this crossbow had enough power to execute Brett's dark plans. In the following days, Brett still frequently visited his mother. The relationship between mother and son remained tense, but deep down, Brett still knew he needed to find the right time to talk to Kristen clearly. To prepare for things getting out of control, Brett decided to hide the crossbow in his mother's garage. He thought this was the safest place to store the weapon and would be easy to retrieve when needed. With this crossbow, Brett felt ready to face any situation. The wedding was approaching, and pressure weighed heavily on Brett. His mother increasingly urged him to be honest with Kristen. Brett knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He had to make a final decision: continue living in lies or face the truth and bear the consequences. On the morning of August 25, 2016, Brett and Kristen woke up as usual. Kristen left for work at 7:30 a.m. Brett stayed alone in the apartment pretending to work diligently at his computer, but his mind was wrestling with chaotic thoughts. If his mother didn't change her decision, events would unfold according to his planned scenario. To create an airtight alibi proving he was home if suspected, Brett set up a complex automated system in the apartment. First, he secured the laptop to the wall using two 4-pound weights. Next, a wooden spoon was attached to the blender's mechanical arm, adjusted to hit the enter key on the keyboard. He set up a timer that would trigger the mechanical arm to press enter, automatically opening a pre-prepared YouTube video. Of course, if police came to the scene, they would find the spoon far from the keyboard and might think it had been moved. Brett's plan became increasingly complex. Besides the automated system, he prepared two mobile phones. These phones were programmed to send two different messages at the exact time of the murders. To ensure authenticity, Brett would need to manually trigger the message sending. He designed a simple system using household items to activate the phone's screens and keyboards. Thanks to these systems, Brett would be able to prove he was at home when the massacre occurred. After completing all preparations, Brett gathered a wig, hat, and clothes for disguise. He would use this outfit to leave the crime scene unrecognized. To avoid being captured by surveillance cameras, Brett carefully studied the camera angles in the building and, learning from his mistakes in the bank robberies, planned his movements carefully. After completing all preparations, Brett began executing his plan. He decided to walk down 14 flights of stairs and sneak out of the building through the back alley. From there, he would head to Scarborough Center, and then take a bus to his mother's house. At exactly 10 a.m., Brett appeared at Susan's door. He directly asked his mother if she had changed her mind, whether she would agree to fund the wedding without telling Kristen. Susan remained firm in her refusal. Immediately, a violent argument erupted between mother and son. The arguing grew so loud that neighbors took notice. Feeling the situation escalating, the frightened mother quickly called her eldest son, Christopher, asking him to come and intervene. Faced with his mother's determination, Brett understood he could never change her mind. With the wedding approaching, Brett felt desperate because he couldn't afford it. He feared Kristen would discover the truth and call off their engagement. In desperation, Brett ran to the garage where he had hidden the crossbow and returned to attack his mother. His fists rained down on the mother, who had loved and helped him through difficult times. Then, Brett searched for a rope in the garage and began strangling her. At that moment, Brett only thought about concealing the truth, caring about nothing else. Knowing his brother Christopher would arrive soon, Brett frantically loaded the crossbow, hid in the garage, and waited for Christopher to appear. When Christopher entered and saw his mother lying lifeless on the ground before he could react, Brett shot him in the neck, causing immediate death. As a precaution, Brett decided to hide his mother's and brother's bodies behind the garage. But while dragging them away, he heard noise from inside the house. It was his youngest brother, Alexander, returning from work. Without time to reload the crossbow, Brett grabbed a brick and rushed to strike Alexander's head. Stunned by the sudden pain, Alexander instinctively pushed his brother away. Alexander tried to escape the house while holding his wound, but due to its severity, he collapsed in the alley. At that moment, Lee also appeared. He had been taking an afternoon nap in the house and had just woken up hearing screams in the living room. Lee went outside and saw Alexander lying in a pool of blood. He quickly ran back inside to call emergency services. When he entered the house, he encountered Brett, who hadn't yet reloaded his crossbow and was cleaning up the crime scene and retrieving the used crossbow. Upon seeing Lee, Brett immediately attacked him, and a struggle ensued with both sides throwing objects at each other. Then, Brett shot Lee in the head, stunning him. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he went to get another arrow, but when he returned to the room, Lee was gone. He had managed to escape and was now in front of a neighbor's house, warning the entire neighborhood that his brother Brett was going berserk and attacking everyone in the family before losing consciousness. Everything was over for Brett. He knew clearly he had no escape route left. He had just massacred 3 family members, his mother, his brother Christopher, and his brother Alexander. Lee was currently unconscious, and when he woke up, he would identify who had caused all this. Finally, Brett sat down in front of the house and allowed himself to be arrested without any resistance. When police arrived at the scene, he coldly confessed, "I used the crossbow to kill them." With the complex developments and rapid pace of the case, the legal proceedings would certainly not be simple. Brett's defense lawyer negotiated a plea deal for him. If fully convicted, Brett would face the death penalty. But the lawyer tried to persuade Brett to plead guilty to less serious charges. First, Brett admitted to attacking his mother, but claimed it was an accident during an argument. He said he had accidentally strangled her after trying to threaten her with an arrow. However, finding a series of evidence showing Brett had carefully prepared to create an alibi made the court doubt the randomness of this incident. Second, Brett agreed to plead guilty to intentionally taking his brother Christopher's life. He had ambushed and killed Christopher with an arrow. Finally, Alexander's death was claimed to be an accident. Brett testified that he had no idea Alexander would be at the scene. At the hearing, Brett would read a prepared letter expressing regret for his wrongful actions. He emphasized that he was extremely remorseful and wanted to make amends for the mistakes he had caused. The judge showed sympathy for the killer's apology. Brett cried, trying to portray the image of a repentant person, though it was apparent he was trying to demonstrate remorse. But was it genuine? Many people believed Brett was simply putting on an act to reduce his punishment. Not only his own family, but even those close to the Ryan family had turned their backs on him. They could never forgive the cruel actions Brett had committed. After the trial in July 2017, Brett Ryan was sentenced to life imprisonment. In the early hours of July 23, 2015, a 911 dispatch center in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma received a frantic call from a 12-year-old boy. In a panic-stricken voice, he reported that one of his older brothers had lost control and was attacking family members with an axe. While he was still on the phone, there was the sound of a door opening, followed by a terrifying scream. and then the call went dead. This is the story of Robert and Michael Bever, two brothers who had been harboring plans to murder their entire family for months before the tragedy unfolded. The Bever family lived in a large two-story house at 709 Magnolia Court. The household consisted of David Bever, 52, his wife April Bever, 44, and their 7 children: Robert, 18, Michael, 16, Crystal, 13, Daniel, 12, Christopher, 7, Victoria, 5, and Autumn, 2. The Beavers lived an extremely isolated life. Neighbors rarely saw them, and if anyone asked about the family, the only response was that they were unusually reclusive. David and April constantly instilled in their children the belief that the outside world was dangerous, to the point where none of the children were allowed to attend school. Instead, April took on the responsibility of homeschooling, though the quality of education was questionable, as she simply downloaded worksheets from the internet for the children to complete on their own. This isolation and disconnection from the outside world would prove to be a crucial element in this tragedy. Confined within the walls of their home with no external contact beyond their immediate family, the children were deprived of basic social experiences and norms. Without real-world interactions, their sense of right and wrong became distorted, making them more susceptible to negative influences. In this environment, the internet became their only window to the outside world, and unfortunately, Robert and Michael became drawn to dark stories of murders, disappearances, and family massacres. The two brothers gradually developed an unhealthy obsession with notorious killers. This fascination became increasingly dangerous, particularly for Robert, who would often joke with his siblings about someday going to kill someone and becoming famous like the killers he admired online. With what little money he had saved, Robert began secretly stockpiling knives and protective gear. Crystal, their 13-year-old sister, noticed her brother's disturbing behavior and tried to warn their mother April, but she dismissed these concerns, saying it was normal for teenage boys to have such interests. When the family got internet access, Robert began creating YouTube content on what was then a relatively new platform. In 2013, he uploaded his first video, which seemed harmless compared to what would happen 2 years later. The video focused on Minecraft, with Robert explaining how the game worked on his computer and mentioning how Michael had accidentally deleted his game data. He also uploaded a short cryptic video without any explanation or description, which he simply called a sketch. While the content was unclear, his presence on YouTube showed Robert's early attempts at gaining an online presence before his descent into horror. It's a tragic irony that Robert, who once sought attention through online videos, would choose to massacre his family instead. The nightmare began around 11:30 p.m. on July 22, 2015. Everyone in the house was in their own space, completely unaware of the impending tragedy. The 3 youngest children, Christopher, Victoria, and Autumn, were sound asleep. In the master bedroom, David was dozing off in front of the television. In the living room, April and Crystal were watching an evening program together. Meanwhile, in another room, Robert and Michael were quietly preparing for the bloodbath they had been planning for so long. On their bed lay an array of knives, and they were wearing body armor. Tonight, after months of waiting, they had decided to turn their dark intentions into reality. Before midnight, April asked Crystal to tell her brothers to do the dishes. Following the family's chore rotation schedule, it was Robert and Michael's turn that evening. Crystal walked to her brother's bedroom, opened the door slightly, and discovered them wearing strange protective gear. At her young age, she didn't realize anything was amiss and entered the room. Robert and Michael were caught off guard. They hadn't expected this interruption and hadn't established any specific signals to begin their attack, like they'd seen in documentaries. Michael turned to Robert and whispered, "We have to do it now," Robert replied. Yes, with chilling calmness, they began their horrific plan, with their 13-year-old sister becoming their first victim. Michael lured Crystal by claiming he had a new computer game to show her. Unsuspecting, she approached the screen. While Michael pretended to open tabs on the computer, Robert silently approached his sister with a knife ready. In a clumsy attempt, Robert tried to place the knife against Crystal's throat and strike, but real life proved different from movies. Taking someone's life requires a level of brutality that Robert wasn't prepared for. According to forensic analysis, to fatally wound someone with a knife requires significant force, similar to surgical precision, as victims don't always die immediately. Blood flow to the brain must be completely stopped. Robert didn't know this, and despite his efforts, his initial attack wasn't immediately fatal. Crystal remained conscious and began to feel the horrific pain. She tried to escape the room in terror, but received multiple stab wounds as she fled. In panic, she tumbled down the stairs, her body creating a series of chaotic sounds as she fell. She managed to cry out for her mother, and when April rushed to find her daughter staggering, she too was immediately attacked by Robert and Michael, becoming the first fatality at the scene. Despite not understanding why her sons were wearing body armor and wielding knives, April tried desperately to protect Crystal, but suffered 48 stab wounds to her arms, neck, face, chest, and stomach. Later, when Crystal lay unconscious near the front door just a few feet away, Robert, showing complete emotional detachment, grabbed his sister's legs, dragged her back inside, and inflicted more stab wounds. The massacre seemed to have no clear motive. Although Robert and Michael later admitted to disliking their parents, they had no apparent reason to subject their entire family, especially their innocent younger siblings, to such horror. The terror continued to escalate. After attacking Crystal and their mother, Robert asked Michael about the location of the remaining family members. Despite the screams and chaos throughout the house, no one else had emerged, and their father David seemed to still be sleeping, showing no reaction. However, Michael discovered that Christopher and Victoria had fled to the bathroom and locked themselves inside. Michael was determined not to let anyone survive, wanting to surpass the notorious killers he idolized from documentaries. Michael approached the bathroom door, tried to open it, and whispered to Christopher, "Open the door, Robert will hurt me." Trusting his brother, Christopher opened the door, only to immediately realize his mistake when he saw Michael standing there with a knife. No cry for help could save Christopher and Victoria now. Without hesitation, Michael inflicted fatal wounds on both children, each receiving approximately 20 stab wounds, killing them instantly. Throughout this chaos, their father David remained asleep in his room, unaware that his wife and children were being systematically murdered. Despite the strange noises from the stairway, he hadn't checked what was happening, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in his own home. Much later, after hearing the unusual sounds, David finally woke up. Still groggy from his short sleep and not fully alert, he stepped out of his room trying to understand what was happening in the house. At that moment, he encountered Robert, who quickly attacked him with 28 stab wounds. David fell to the floor with no chance to defend himself. At this point, only 3 members of the Bever family remained alive. 2-year-old Autumn still sleeping in her room, Crystal, who despite severe injuries and blood loss was fighting to stay conscious, and Daniel, the 12-year-old boy who had quickly grabbed a phone and hidden in his father's study. It was Daniel who would later be hailed as a hero for calling emergency services and helping to prevent the massacre from continuing. No one in the neighboring area had heard or seen anything unusual. Daniel, hiding under his father's desk, made the crucial 911 call that would later be released to the public. In this brief call, the boy whispered, "Help, help, my brother is attacking my family, please help." Shortly after, the door to the room apparently opened. Despite his terror, Daniel pleaded with his brothers, but tragically, he was attacked with 21 stab wounds to his stomach, chest, head, neck, and back. Thanks to Daniel's call, police quickly dispatched a rapid response team to the scene. When the first officers arrived, they witnessed a horrific scene. They found Crystal who, despite severe injuries, was still breathing and managed to whisper that her 2 brothers were the attackers. Police immediately secured the area and deployed K-9 units to track down Robert and Michael. The brothers, who didn't have driver's licenses and couldn't steal their parents' car, were still in the vicinity. The heavily wooded area and darkness made the search more challenging. After about 10 minutes of fleeing, Robert and Michael were found hiding less than half a mile away under a small creek. They were completely lost, with no concrete escape plan. Eventually, both were forced to surrender when cornered by the K-9 units. During the arrest, Michael suffered minor injuries from a police dog, while Robert showed no fear or remorse. Instead, he appeared proud of what he had done. When the first police team entered the house, they discovered dozens of weapons in Robert and Michael's room, including knives, axes, picks, and scissors, along with protective equipment like knee pads, elbow pads, helmets, and a USB drive containing their secrets. Although the massacre happened hastily, Robert and Michael had detailed plans stored on the USB drive found in Michael's computer. The contents revealed intentions for a massacre even larger than the notorious Columbine High School shooting in 1999, where 15 people were killed and 24 were injured. Despite the significant difference between shooting up a high school and massacring one's family, Robert and Michael harbored these ambitious plans, even though they didn't have guns at the time. In fact, the brothers had already ordered firearms and ammunition to carry out their plan, and the family massacre wasn't supposed to happen so soon. However, when Crystal accidentally walked in on them wearing body armor with knives ready, Robert and Michael feared their plan would be exposed. They worried their parents would confiscate everything, forcing them to act immediately, even though it meant having to clean up the crime scene and stay quiet while waiting for their weapons to arrive. The fear of discovery and Daniel's emergency call disrupted their plans to film the massacre and upload it to social media to initiate a chain of violent events. The brothers had planned to use the family car for their crime spree. However, there was no evidence that either of them had a driver's license, and since the family rarely left home, it's likely neither had any driving experience. According to their plan, once they acquired weapons, they would drive from town to town, randomly attacking people to achieve notoriety. Their goal wasn't just to satisfy a thirst for violence. They wanted to become Wikipedia entries and the subject of news reports and documentaries. While their larger plan was thwarted, sadly, they did achieve a kind of infamy by becoming notorious names in criminal history. Despite everything, we can all agree that Daniel's quick thinking to grab a phone and call 911 saved countless innocent lives. Robert and Michael were arrested and interrogated immediately afterward. In the United States, interrogations are typically filmed and can be made public. When the Bever brothers' plans were revealed, their attempts at defense were noteworthy, but what stood out most was that Michael Bever was the only one who appeared in the broadcast footage. In the video, Michael, a frail-looking 16-year-old who appeared ashamed of his situation, blamed his brother Robert, claiming Robert was the mastermind and that the plan had only begun on June 30th, less than a month before the massacre. Michael portrayed himself as someone who got caught up in the crime, claiming he had no choice but to participate for fear that if he didn't, Robert would kill him like the others. Michael admitted to possibly stabbing some family members, but described it as an act of losing control in a crazy world. Robert's attitude was completely opposite to Michael's. He showed pride in what he had done and provided detailed accounts of the events, giving investigators a clear picture of what happened. When questioned about harming his family members, Robert didn't hesitate to confess, even mentioning that he had planned to decapitate his youngest sister Autumn, who only survived because she was asleep and the brothers forgot about her in their frenzy. While Michael offered no clear justification for his actions, Robert had many reasons for hating his parents. According to Robert, his parents were cruel people who didn't love their children. He even believed his mother had 7 children just to collect tax benefits and social welfare. Robert described a dark home life filled with neglect and violence. He claimed his parents not only ignored his paranoid fears about the outside world, but also regularly used physical punishment. In one instance, he recalled how David had pushed him down the stairs just for forgetting to turn off a light. In court, a major question arose. Could the toxic family environment with signs of psychological disorders and parental abuse serve as mitigating circumstances for Robert and Michael? Or should their youth, especially Michael's, influence whether the U.S. justice system would give them a second chance? However, from the start, the Oklahoma justice system was clear in its decision. Robert and Michael would be tried as adults because their crimes were premeditated and planned with intentions to commit even more horrific acts. Robert, as the eldest at the time of the crime, faced the death penalty for being considered the mastermind and showing no remorse. He never shed a tear for his family, nor expressed any regret for his actions, in complete contrast to Michael. Realizing his complete failure, Robert attempted suicide in his cell on June 17, 2016, but was discovered and saved by a guard. After this unsuccessful attempt, Robert decided to plead guilty. Initially, both Robert and Michael had pleaded not guilty despite overwhelming evidence. They were caught at the scene, their detailed plans were found on the USB drive, and their fingerprints were everywhere. During interrogation, they confessed to the details but refused to plead guilty, perhaps hoping to use mental illness as a defense and promising not to reoffend. However, this strategy failed in the U.S. justice system because their plans were too well documented and their actions showed calculation rather than loss of control. Finally, Robert pleaded guilty and received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, being deemed too dangerous for rehabilitation. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, taking full responsibility for his crimes. Michael steadfastly maintained his not guilty plea, with his defense clearly positioning him as merely a follower who was drawn into his brother Robert's actions. To this day, he appears not to fully comprehend the gravity of his crimes. One might be tempted to believe his defense if not for the drawings discovered in his notebook depicting weapons and murdered victims. Despite his seemingly gentle appearance, this evidence showed that Michael, like Robert, was fully committed to their brutal plan. On August 9, 2018, at age 19, Michael was sentenced to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 38 years, contingent upon favorable psychological evaluations. He could potentially be released by 2050. Meanwhile, Crystal and Autumn were adopted by other family members with the hope that they would grow up in a safer environment and never follow the dark path chosen by their brothers. The story of Robert and Michael Bever ends in profound sadness, with no explanation other than the brutality they learned from true crime documentaries and stories about serial killers on the internet. This case clearly raises serious concerns about proper parenting and the importance of monitoring children's internet access. Story 1. A very special athlete, a hellacious competitor, is Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit found dead in his Atlanta home along with his wife and young son. They say they cannot believe this has happened. What role steroids played in the Benoit murder-suicide, the tragedy has made clear. I have battled and lost. On June 24, 2007, the wrestling world woke up to a tragedy that would forever change its history. Chris Benoit, the former WWE World Heavyweight Champion, was now a part of one of the most horrifying events in wrestling history. In a shocking turn of events, Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found dead in their Fayetteville, Georgia home. What seemed like an ordinary tragedy quickly turned into something much darker, a triple homicide followed by Benoit's own suicide. This wasn't the man fans knew and loved, this was something else. But why? What would drive a hero to commit such a horrific act? Today we're taking a look into the details of that weekend, and what caused a WWE hero to commit a murder-suicide. Benoit was known as a devoted family man, especially by those closest to him. To the wrestling world, though, he was a powerhouse, one of the biggest names in the sport. At 40 years old, he was on the rise, taking on fight after fight. The rabid Wolverine was especially beloved in his home country of Canada, where it seemed he could balance his brutal in-ring persona with being the perfect father at home. Wrestling icon Chris Jericho once said, "But Benoit had a demanding life." In wrestling, careers are often shorter than in other fields, a reality driven by the dangerous nature of the sport. Even though the matches are scripted, the physical toll is real. Wrestlers get banged up, often enduring injuries that would sideline anyone else. Still, they push themselves to perform as many matches as possible during their limited window of opportunity. Benoit was no exception. He was always on the road jumping from one ring to the next, no matter how far he traveled. If there was a show, he was there. That's what made what happened on June 23, 2007, all the more shocking. Leading up to the tragedy, Chris Benoit's behavior began to raise serious concerns among those closest to him. As a seasoned wrestler, Benoit was no stranger to the demands of the WWE schedule, but in the days before his family's death, something changed. On June 22, 2007, Benoit was scheduled to travel to a WWE event in Houston, Texas, but he missed his flight, which was highly unusual for him. Chavo Guerrero, a close friend and fellow wrestler, was the first to notice that something was off. When Benoit finally reached out to him, his voice sounded strange, almost disconnected. During the phone call, Benoit showed his love for Chavo in a way that wasn't normal, and that got him really concerned. Benoit then explained that his wife, Nancy, had been vomiting blood, and that their son, Daniel, was also seriously ill. This was more than enough to worry anyone, and it seemed like a reasonable explanation for his absence. Chavo thought that it was likely a temporary situation, and hoped to catch up with Benoit when they eventually met in Houston. But the next day, Benoit's behavior became even more bizarre. He left a series of odd voicemails for Chavo, apologizing for missing the show, but assuring him that he would catch the next flight to Houston. The voicemail didn't sound like Benoit, though. His tone was off, and his words seemed somewhat erratic. He also mentioned that he would be in Houston by 8 a.m., which was inconsistent with the time he would have needed to make the flight. What seemed like a simple family emergency had quickly turned into something alarming, and Chavo wasn't the only one who noticed. Others in the WWE community were beginning to worry that something bad was about to happen. Benoit mentioned that he had missed his flight and would be late to the WWE event in Beaumont, Texas, which was unusual since he was a professional who was always on time. He sounded groggy and exhausted and ended the message with an, "It wasn't something Benoit typically said to a colleague," and it raised red flags. At first, Chavo tried to brush it off, thinking, maybe Benoit is just overwhelmed with his sick family and all the care he's been providing. But something still felt off. So, just 12 minutes after receiving the voicemail, Chavo called him back, only to get no answer. He left a message, asking Benoit to call him back ASAP. At 3:44 p.m., Benoit returned the call and explained he missed the first call because he was changing his flight to a later time. Chavo was still uneasy and asked if something else was going on. Benoit brushed it off, claiming it had been an extremely stressful day and that his family suddenly falling ill had worn him out. But Chavo didn't buy it because he had known Benoit long enough to know there was more to the story, but he decided not to push. They'd talk later, after the fight. Chavo ended the call with, at 3:51 a.m. on Sunday, June 24th, Chavo and Scott Armstrong, both close friends of Benoit, received more odd texts from him. One of the messages contained the address of Benoit's family home, while the other mentioned that his dogs were safely locked in their enclosure near the pool, and that the garage door was still open. The texts were strange, but it was 3:51 a.m., so no one thought much of it. They figured it was just an accident, and went back to sleep. Chavo assumed Benoit had just made a mistake. A few hours later, Chavo was standing outside Houston Airport, waiting for Benoit to arrive. But hours passed, and he never showed. WWE officials took the next step, and called the Fayetteville police to perform a welfare check on Benoit and his family. On Monday, June 25, 2007, the WWE was getting ready for Raw in Corpus Christi. Johnny Ace was shown texts sent from Benoit and Nancy's phones early Sunday morning. These were texts that didn't exactly sound like they were coming from someone in the right frame of mind. With no word from Benoit, WWE called in the Fayetteville police for a welfare check. By 4:15 p.m., they got the call. 3 bodies were found in the Benoit house, and the scene was officially labeled a major crime scene. The bodies of Chris, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found in different parts of the house. The murders of Nancy and Daniel were a nightmare. On Friday, June 22nd, 2007, Benoit murdered his wife in the bonus room of their Fayetteville home. Police later revealed that Nancy's limbs were bound before her death, with her arms tied with coaxial cables and her feet duct taped together. In the kitchen trash, they found a balled-up tube sock and tape, soaked in dried blood. Authorities believed it was used as a makeshift gag before Nancy was killed. Her body was discovered wrapped in a blanket next to a Bible. The injuries showed that Benoit had pressed his knee into her back while pulling a cord around her neck, strangling her. But there were no signs of a struggle leading up to her death, and toxicology reports found alcohol in Nancy's system. But it was unclear whether it was consumed before her death or because of decomposition. The decomposition also made it hard to determine the levels of hydrocodone and alprazolam that were present in her body. But the medical examiner found no evidence that Nancy was as sedated as their son had been before he was killed. Daniel was Benoit's 3rd child and 2nd son, who was found dead in his bedroom the following day, June 23, 2007. Daniel had 2 older siblings from Benoit's first marriage and was Nancy's only child. He was suffocated, and another Bible was found next to his body. But there were no bruises. The internal injuries to his throat confirmed the cause of death. Reports concluded that Daniel had been sedated with Xanax and was unconscious at the time of his death. His body had started decomposing, but it wasn't nearly as bad as his mother. Just hours before taking his own life on June 24, 2007, Benoit's internet searches raised serious questions about what he was planning. Among the final searches were how to tie a knot for hanging and how long it would take for a body to decompose. These types of searches are proof of a man who wasn't spiraling in confusion, but preparing for something diabolical. The last known photograph of Benoit, taken on June 22, 2000, captured him at Dr. Phil Aston's office, which would precede the nightmare about to unfold. Investigations later revealed Benoit had searched for ways to break a neck, a disturbing detail disclosed by his former fiancée, Nancy Toffalone, during a 2016 podcast. However, the Fayette County Sheriff's Office report didn't confirm these searches, and Benoit's autopsy didn't show neck injuries. Then there was the note, a final message found in a Bible next to the bodies of his wife and son. It simply read, "I'm preparing to leave this earth." No one knew exactly what it meant, but it felt like a final goodbye, maybe even a confession, as if Benoit was trying to make sense of what he had just done. The note was later sent to his first wife, Martina, and their 2 children in Canada. Benoit's father, Michael, confirmed it existed, suggesting the tragedy was planned rather than impulsive. The Bible, found beside Nancy and Daniel as well, only added to the dark nature of the scene. The note reflected guilt, while others saw it as Benoit finally coming to terms with his actions. In his final days, Benoit's life was overshadowed by darkness. Years of head injuries from wrestling had taken a severe toll on his brain, and the emotional weight of losing his close friend Eddie Guerrero seemed to push him further into despair. His mental state had gotten worse, and this combination of physical and emotional struggles ultimately led to one of the most tragic and disturbing events in wrestling history. He was found in his home gym, hanging from a pulley system with a towel around his neck. The weight of the gym equipment caused his neck to snap instantly. He removed the bar from a lat pull-down machine in his gym and fashioned a noose from the machine's cable. After releasing the weights, he strangled himself to death. It was a brutal, shocking way to end his life. No one could have expected it, especially after what he'd done to his own family. Toxicology reports on Benoit showed elevated testosterone levels, consistent with steroid use. They also found traces of Xanax and hydrocodone, which led to more questions. Was he under the influence when he murdered Nancy and Daniel? It's impossible to know for sure, but his mental state in those final days clearly wasn't stable. Looking at the crime scene, the autopsies and the toxicology reports prove this was a methodical crime. Benoit took days to kill his wife, his son, and finally himself. Steroids were found in the Benoit house, which means roid rage might have been behind his actions. Some doctors have connected steroid use to uncontrollable anger and other psychological issues, including paranoia. Authorities also noticed a big gap between the deaths of Nancy and their son Daniel, which suggests that the murders were deliberate rather than out-of-control anger, and placing a Bible next to each body isn't consistent with a violent outburst. Prosecutors in New York began looking into Benoit's deliveries from Signature Pharmacy and MedXLife.com, companies that sold steroids and HGH online. Terrence Kindlon, the lawyer for MedXLife co-owner Gary Brandwine, denied the accusations that his client had sold steroids to Benoit. Sports Illustrated later reported that 3 packages from Signature Pharmacy were sent to Benoit, with the first arriving in December 2005 at a Texas address. A second was sent in February 2006 to Peachtree City, Georgia, and the third in July 2006 to Fort Walton Beach, Florida. This was part of a broader investigation into steroid use among wrestlers that named several other wrestlers, including Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Edge, and Gregory Helms. After the Benoit family tragedy, everyone wanted answers, but the more authorities looked into it, the more questions they found. By the time they discovered the bodies of Nancy and Daniel Benoit on June 25, 2007, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, but the picture never really came together. The investigation was straightforward enough. Benoit murdered his wife and son before ending his own life. But something felt off. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. The scene was unsettlingly calm. Nancy's hands and feet were bound, and a Bible was found next to her and Daniel. Was this a sign of Benoit's breakdown? Or was he trying to make some twisted sense of what he'd done? Then there were the searches. Benoit's internet history was, well, disturbing. He'd Googled how to break a neck and how long it takes for a body to decompose. And the final search was on how to tie a knot for hanging. Benoit spent his last hours meticulously planning everything. Forensics didn't exactly clear things up. Benoit died from hanging with no broken neck, like some had speculated. Instead, he used a towel and pulley system in his home gym. Was this an attempt to control his death, or just a sign of impaired judgment? We'll never know for sure. The toxicology report showed elevated testosterone levels that proved long-term steroid use. But it wasn't just the drugs. Benoit's autopsy revealed early signs of dementia and CTE. This was brain damage from years of hits to the head. CTE messes with your behavior, causes mood swings, and can lead to violence. Could that have been the tipping point? To top it all off, Eddie Guerrero, Benoit's best friend, died 2 years earlier, and many believe that loss pushed him over the edge. Eddie's passing hit him hard, and people close to Benoit have said it sent him into a downward spiral. He became more withdrawn, distant, and seemed to be struggling mentally. The combination of losing someone so close, along with the physical wear and tear from years of wrestling, put a lot of pressure on him. That pressure, along with everything else he was dealing with, probably started breaking him down mentally and emotionally. Neuroscientist and former wrestler Christopher Nowinski believes Benoit's had too many untreated concussions, which might have slowly eaten away at his mental health. Nowinski pointed out that Benoit was one of the few wrestlers who willingly took chair shots to the back of his head, which was downright reckless. After testing Benoit's brain, Dr. Julian Bales, head of neurosurgery at West Virginia University, found that Benoit's brain was in such bad shape that it looked like it belonged to an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Other tests revealed Benoit had severe chronic traumatic encephalopathy, with damage spreading across all 4 lobes of his brain and brainstem. Bales and his team concluded that this kind of brain trauma could lead to dementia, which might trigger extreme behavioral issues. Benoit's father later suggested that this brain damage was likely the root cause of the tragic murder-suicide, but the WWE dismissed this as speculative. Nancy had also filed for divorce in May 2003, claiming abuse from Benoit, but withdrew the filing 3 months later. In 2008, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that Nancy may have suspected Benoit of having an affair with a female WWE wrestler, and the couple might have also fought over a life insurance policy. This information came from a report released by the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. There's no simple answer to what caused the Benoit family tragedy, but several theories have tried to make sense of how everything went so horribly wrong. WWE Chairman Vince McMahon weighed in on the tragedy, saying that it was a result of mental health issues combined with the brutal physical toll of Benoit's wrestling career. McMahon believes that Benoit's actions weren't just about steroids, but rather the damage done to his body and the emotional strain he was under. While McMahon's comments were controversial, it makes sense when you consider how wrestling affects people physically and mentally. Benoit was clearly struggling, and this was a tragic result of the years of stress, both physical and emotional, that he'd been under. A strange detail also surfaced when a statement about Nancy's death was added to the Chris Benoit Wikipedia page just 14 hours before police discovered the bodies of Benoit and his family. The update read, Chris Benoit was replaced by Johnny Nitro for the ECW World Championship match at Vengeance, as Benoit was not there due to personal issues stemming from the death of his wife Nancy. It was spotted by Wyckonos and later picked up by Fox News. The addition was made at 4 a.m. on June 25th, nearly 10.5 hours before the bodies were discovered at 2:30 p.m. the same day. What's more bizarre is that the IP address of the editor traced back to Stamford, Connecticut, the WWE headquarters at the time. When this early report made its way into the media, the anonymous editor claimed it was just a huge coincidence and nothing more. Story 2. I just want to say I'm very happy that it's all over. It's been a long time waiting for this. It really happened with the prosecution team. They've really done a great job. They say justice doesn't bring back the dead, but it can bring a sliver of peace to the living. For Connie Bennett, the woman whose haunted face you see in that video, peace is a long time coming. 41 years ago, her world shattered when she discovered her son and his family brutally murdered in their Colorado home. And trust me when I say it wasn't just horrifying, it was the kind of nightmare that keeps you awake at night. The killer didn't just stop at using a hammer to end his victims' lives. He went even further, committing unspeakable acts that shocked everyone who heard the details. At that time, forensic science wasn't what it is today, and for years, his connection to the Bennett family murders and several other killings remained hidden. The truth only came to light when advances in technology finally exposed the full scope of his horrifying spree. So who was this twisted murderer? And how did he go unnoticed for so long? Well, before we dive into his dark history, let's start by getting to know the victims first. Like any other family, the Bennett family was full of love, laughter, and big dreams. Bruce and Deborah Bennett, a young couple who got married in the 1970s, couldn't wait to start their life together. Bruce, born on April 22, 1956, in Denver, Colorado, had what you might call a normal childhood. Nothing too extraordinary, just a regular guy growing up with his 2 brothers, Richard and Daniel. But Deborah's story was a bit more complicated. As the oldest of 4 kids, she had to grow up fast after losing her mother at a young age. With her dad, Ernest, a war veteran, she became the caretaker for her younger siblings. Life was tough, but she kept her family together. Eventually, they moved to Colorado, and it was there that Deborah's brother Larry introduced her to Bruce. The two hit it off instantly. and before long Bruce and Deborah were inseparable. They fell in love quickly and decided to start a family of their own. Later on, Bruce enlisted in the Navy, serving as a sonar analyst at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a job that gave him the chance to work with some pretty high-tech equipment, and more importantly, provided the steady income he needed to support his growing family. So in January of 1976, their first daughter, Melissa, was born, and they couldn't have been more thrilled. Then, 5 years later, in 1981, their second daughter, Vanessa, arrived. Their little family of 4 was complete. When Bruce wrapped up his service in the Navy, he had worked hard to create a more comfortable life for them. In 1983, with some help from their savings and a loan, they bought their first home in Aurora, Colorado. Life seemed perfect. The Bennetts worked together in the family's furniture distribution business, and Bruce was also studying to become an air traffic controller. They were making it work. Every day was filled with moments of joy, family dinners, and the excitement of their daughters growing up in a happy, safe home. Melissa and Vanessa were thriving in this warm, loving environment, and Bruce and Deborah felt like they had everything they ever wanted. But just when everything seemed perfect, in early 1984, their world was shattered. It was Sunday, January 15th that year, when the Bennett family was in full celebration mode. They were hosting a pre-birthday gathering for Melissa, who was about to turn 8. Deborah had already planned a party at school for their daughter, but they decided to have an additional family celebration at home. The house was filled with laughter, chatter, and the sweet aroma of a delicious cake as everyone gathered to celebrate the little girl's upcoming special day. As the evening wore on, Melissa's grandparents and uncles started to head home. One of her uncles noticed the garage door was still open and reminded Bruce to close it before he left. Little did he know that simple gesture would be the turning point for the Bennett family. Then, the next morning, on January 16, 1984, Bruce's mother, Constance Connie Bennett, got an unsettling call. The family's furniture store had called, stating that Bruce and Deborah hadn't shown up for work, and no one was answering their phones at the house. Concerned, Connie decided to head over to the Bennett home to check on them. When she arrived, she immediately noticed the garage door was still open, just like the night before. But what she found inside the house would haunt her forever. As she entered, Connie was met with a scene so horrifying, it's unimaginable. Bruce's lifeless body lay at the foot of the stairs, surrounded by a pool of blood. His head was severely battered, and there was a deep, horrific cut across his throat. In shock, Connie rushed to a neighbor's house for help, and they quickly called 911. The police and emergency responders arrived soon after, but what they discovered inside the house was beyond belief. In the master bedroom, they found Deborah's body, her head horribly beaten, just like Bruce's. The deaths were already beyond shocking, but what they discovered in the children's room was even worse. There, little Melissa's body was found, beaten badly and stabbed. Her face was covered by a blanket, and there were clear signs of SA. It was a parent's worst nightmare, something no one could ever prepare for. But in the middle of the horror, there was a tiny flicker of hope. 3-year-old Vanessa, despite her terrible injuries, was still alive. She was rushed to the hospital, hanging on by the smallest thread. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As Vanessa was rushed to the hospital, the investigators started to comb through the scene. What used to be a home full of love and laughter was now a place of terror and clues. Outside, they found Deborah's purse lying in the snow, clearly searched through by whoever did this. Nearby, a butcher knife from the family's kitchen was found, probably one of the weapons used in the attack. But the real weapon, the one that delivered the deadly blows, was still missing. And based on the injuries, the investigators believed a hammer might have been used. They carefully gathered fingerprints and other samples from various surfaces in the hope of finding something that could lead them to the killer. But there was one detail that stood out above the rest: bloodstained boot prints. Prints no one in the family recognized. This was someone new, someone who shouldn't have been there. To widen the search, authorities called in family members and close friends who had attended Melissa's birthday party earlier that day. They asked them to provide DNA samples, something that seemed strange at the time, but would later prove to be an important step. Genetic studies were still in their infancy back then, but the investigators knew they had to gather anything that could be useful down the line. As the investigation continued, specialists carefully preserved the victim's clothing and meticulously collected bits of carpet from beneath Melissa's body, a bedspread, and other items that could provide clues. Every scrap of evidence was carefully preserved, hoping that one small detail would crack the case open. Meanwhile, in the hospital, a team of medical professionals fought tirelessly to keep little Vanessa alive. At just 3 years old, she was in critical condition. The doctors reported that Vanessa had suffered severe injuries. Her jaw was shattered, her head severely injured, and her arms, hips, and legs were all broken. She had also been SA. It was nothing short of a miracle that she was still alive. She needed 3 units of blood and several more units of fluids just to keep her stable. But despite all the efforts, the doctor's report to the family was devastating. The little girl was fighting for her life, and the outlook was uncertain. As the days dragged on, investigators began to realize something chilling. The attack on the Bennett family wasn't an isolated incident. Less than 2 weeks before that brutal night, there had been similar attacks in Colorado, one of them eerily close to home. On January 4th, just days before the Bennetts were attacked, a young couple, James and Kimberly, had been ambushed in their home in Aurora. They were having a quiet night, Kimberly in the bedroom, while James was in another room recording music for a friend. Out of nowhere, Kimberly was struck in the head in the dark. She caught a brief glimpse of a man's silhouette before he fled when she screamed. James, hearing her scream, rushed to her side but was struck in the head by the same hammer-wielding attacker. Despite his injury, James managed to chase the assailant, but the attacker escaped into the night. Meanwhile, Kimberly was able to call 911 that night. Emergency services quickly arrived, and both James and Kimberly were transported to the hospital. James suffered a skull fracture, and Kimberly had a concussion, but they both eventually recovered. When the police investigated the scene, they found the hammer that had been used in the attack. It was clear that the attacker had entered the house through the garage, which had been left open. Fresh footprints in the snow led away from the house, but the trail eventually mixed with other tracks, and they lost the lead. However, the police did find Kimberly's purse in the snow, though it was missing only the money. Now, if you thought that was the end of it, well, think again. Less than a week later, another shocking attack rocked the Colorado community. Patricia Smith, a 50-year-old woman who had recently moved from Nebraska, was there to help her daughter and her 2 young grandchildren settle into their new home. Patricia was well known for her grace, elegance, and impressive client list as an interior decorator, beloved by everyone who knew her. But on January 10, 1984, her life would be tragically cut short in the most horrifying way. It all started like any other day. Patricia took her daughter to the park so she could catch the bus to work, then dropped off the grandkids at daycare. Afterwards, she spent the morning working, picked up some laundry, and grabbed a quick hamburger for lunch. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when Patricia arrived home, things quickly took a deadly turn. She went up to her room, turned on the TV, and then, for reasons unknown, headed back downstairs. That's when she came face to face with an intruder. Before she could even react, a savage attack unfolded right in her own living room, blows so brutal that they ended her life in a matter of seconds. That evening, around 5:30, Patricia's daughter, who had been waiting at the park for her mom to pick her up, started to panic when Patricia didn't show. She called home from a public phone, but no one picked up. Concerned, she reached out to a cousin who came to pick her up along with the kids. They headed home, but when they got there, something didn't feel right. The garage door was wide open, and inside, the TV was flickering in the dark house. As they made their way inside, they stumbled upon a scene so horrific it was almost impossible to process. There, in the living room, was Patricia's lifeless body, covered with a child's blanket, blood everywhere. Her pants and boots were scattered around, and her upper clothing was open, a chilling sign that another brutal assault had taken place. A hammer, the weapon used to kill her, lay beside her. The daughter, completely in shock, ran to a neighbor's house, hoping for some kind of confirmation that her mom was still alive. But it was too late. Patricia was gone, 911 was called, and soon the authorities arrived. The investigation into Patricia's death uncovered something truly chilling: 17 brutal blows to her head and clear signs of SA. The killer didn't stop there. After taking Patricia's life, he went upstairs, rifled through her purse, and stole money before fleeing the scene. Authorities turned to Patricia's circle of friends, family, and clients for answers, but no solid leads came through. On that very same day, January 10th, another woman became the target of a vicious attack. Her name was Donna, and she was a flight attendant for Frontier Airlines. That evening, she was off duty, waiting for her partner Ron, who was a pilot, to return from a night flight. She'd spent the evening picking up groceries, getting the mail, and parking her car in the garage. But as she stepped out of her vehicle, she was struck in the temple, knocking her out cold. The next morning, Ron returned home to find something that made his blood run cold. A trail of blood led from the garage to the house, and he rushed inside, following it to the bedroom. There, lying on the bed, was Donna, unconscious, with a severe head wound. Somehow, through all the pain, she had dragged herself to the bedroom. Ron immediately called 911, and Donna was rushed to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had been assaulted. At first, Ron was considered a suspect. After all, he had just returned from his flight, and the attack had happened only an hour before he arrived. But soon enough, investigators ruled him out. The search for the real killer was on. While going through Donna's car, they found a blood-soaked hammer in the driver's seat. They collected it as evidence, but frustratingly, no fingerprints were found. Despite the horrific injuries she had suffered, Donna managed to recover, though the head injury caused significant short-term memory loss. She couldn't remember the details of the attack, but in a way, she was relieved. She was just grateful to be alive. In fact, later on, the couple sat down for an interview, where Donna opened up about the aftermath of the brutal attack, saying, "I say I had the mentality of a 2-year-old. Everything was new to me. Once again, I didn't know a knife and fork. I couldn't even tell you that I can't open my mouth and how hard it is to eat." Now, with all of this being said, this hammer killer was one brazen individual. And just 6 days after the attack on Donna and Ron, and less than 25 miles away from their home, the brutal attack on the Bennett family unfolded. And throughout that heartbreaking January, while the families of the victims were in mourning, those who survived, like little Vanessa, were fighting for their lives and recovery. Vanessa's grandmother, Connie, never gave up hope, praying for the child's healing. Meanwhile, the investigation stretched on, with authorities collecting every bit of evidence they could find from the 4 crime scenes, including genetic material, footprints, and anything else that might point to the killer. But once again, forensic science in the 1980s wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. DNA analysis was still in its early stages, and investigators were working with limited tools. The attacks took place in both Aurora and Lakewood, leading local police to share information. However, despite their efforts, no useful fingerprints were discovered at the crime scenes, or even on the hammers used during the attacks. As the investigation continued, the FBI brought in a profiler to help understand the mind of the killer. The profiler suggested that the attacker wasn't targeting specific victims, but was more of an opportunist, roaming neighborhoods and looking for easy access, like open garage doors. Once he found his way inside, his attacks were swift, violent, and deadly, often followed by sexual assault and theft. Based on the patterns, the profiler estimated that the killer was likely a young man, around 20 years old, smart, but not highly educated. He might have finished high school, but not gone to college. The repeated use of hammers and a distinctive boot print at one scene suggested the man might be working in construction, especially since many homes were being built in the areas where the crimes occurred. But here's the real kicker. The profiler believed this guy wasn't going to stop until he was caught. So investigators went to construction sites, talked to contractors, and tried to find anyone who had noticed something strange. Unfortunately, contractor records were messy, and there wasn't much to go on. Because the attacks were sudden and always happened in the dark, no one had seen the attacker clearly. As the investigation continued with no new leads, the community was on edge. People became extra cautious, locking up their garages and doors like never before. Some even started buying guns or wearing helmets to bed. But time passed without any more attacks, and eventually the police had to move on to other cases, leaving these brutal crimes unsolved. Interestingly, in the year 1990, investigators stumbled upon something unexpected: one single blonde pubic hair. They immediately sent it for specialized analysis, hoping that this might finally be the clue they had been waiting for. But then again, the technology back then wasn't as advanced as it is today, and the test ended up destroying the hair before they could gather any useful information. This was a massive setback, but the investigators refused to give up. Fast forward to 2001, 17 years after the horrific attacks. The breakthrough that everyone had been hoping for finally arrived when the DNA samples were fully identified, clearing family members from suspicion. But even with this significant progress, the mystery was far from over. Then in 2018, the investigation took another turn. This time, detectives teamed up with a genealogist, hoping she could provide the breakthrough they needed. They used the DNA sequence to search through both public and private databases. Just 1 week later, the genealogist gave them a huge piece of the puzzle. She found a match to someone with the last name Ewing. This discovery was massive, but it wasn't the end of the road. The detectives quickly discovered there were several individuals with the last name Ewing living in Colorado, but none of them seemed to fit the profile. They weren't giving up, though. They expanded the search, digging through Aurora's database and finding a total of 40 individuals with that surname. While juggling other cases, the detectives meticulously analyzed each of these individuals, holding on to hope that one of them would be the missing link. Then, in July of 2018, everything clicked. After months of hard work, they discovered a match with an inmate in Nevada, Alex Ewing. Born on August 14, 1960, in North Carolina, little was known about his childhood, but it was clear that Alex had a troubled past. He dropped out of school after the 10th grade, claiming he was expelled for excessive drinking. This marked the start of a chaotic life that spiraled into crime. From a young age, Alex's life was marred by brushes with the law. He was detained in a juvenile center in Sacramento, California, for theft, and was later placed in a foster home. But his time in the foster system was short-lived. He stayed just 2 weeks before being released. His criminal activities didn't stop there. He continued a path of theft, burglary, and even escape, moving from California to Arizona to Florida. By 1983, Alex had secured a driver's license and was living in Denver, Colorado, the same place where the attacks occurred in early 1984, leaving 4 dead and several others severely injured. After the attacks stopped, Alex seemed to vanish from Colorado, but he didn't go far. He moved to Kingman, Arizona, where on January 27, 1984, he broke into a home and attacked Roy Williams with a heavy granite rock, striking him in the head and chest. Roy miraculously survived, but required over 100 stitches. Roy was able to provide a partial description of his attacker, and later that same day, a police officer spotted a man hiding in the bushes near an interstate on-ramp. The officer approached, but Alex fled, leading to a brief but intense chase. On February 2, 1984, Alex was finally apprehended. Alex Ewing was formally charged with attempted first-degree murder and first-degree robbery. He was being held in jail in Utah, but in early August 1984, something shocking happened. While being transported with several other inmates for a court hearing, Alex made a bold escape. He managed to slip away from the authorities during a stop at a service station, wearing nothing but red shorts and an orange jumpsuit. It was around 10 p.m. when police received reports of a suspicious man in red shorts running through a nearby neighborhood. The hunt was on. An hour later, panic set in when Nancy Berry called 911 in a desperate voice, claiming she and her husband had been attacked. Nancy and Chris Berry were found severely injured in their bed. Alex had broken into their home through an open garage door and savagely attacked them with an axe handle. Miraculously, their children were unharmed. A massive manhunt ensued, but Alex was still on the run. 4 days later, Alex was spotted at a phone booth, apparently calling his brother for help. He tried to flee, but by then he was weakened and dehydrated. Police caught up with him, and Alex was back in custody. This time, he faced a mountain of charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, robbery, and escape. He was sentenced to 110 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Alex had been at large for less than 8 months after the attacks in Colorado, but those months were just the beginning of a long, twisted journey. Fast forward to July 2018. A team of Colorado police and prosecutors traveled to the Northern Nevada Correctional Center to interview Alex. They approached him pretending to be non-law enforcement officers, keeping the focus off the Colorado crimes for now. They knew they had the breakthrough they needed: the DNA match from the Bennett and Patricia crime scenes. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but they had to play it smart. During the interview, Alex spoke candidly about his past. He claimed his father had been in the Air Force and discussed his troubled history, mentioning an illness, spinal meningitis, that had nearly killed him, causing a drastic change in his behavior. He also admitted to spending some time working in construction in Colorado, particularly in Aurora and Lakewood, before leaving because it was too cold. This was a crucial detail. It confirmed Alex's presence in Colorado at the time of the attacks. The next day, detectives returned to meet with Alex. This time, they showed him 6 black and white photos of the crimes in Colorado. Initially, Alex denied knowing any of the victims, But when shown a color photo of Patricia alive, he stuck